Wind came off the prairie like a file, worrying the grass down to stubble and hissing through last year's sun-bleached stems. Late afternoon light made the snow patches shine hard as salt along the creek bottom. Above them, the cut bank rose in a long slanted shoulder of earth, clay, roots and stones stacked by time, facing south as if it wanted the weak winter sun. Caleb Rourke set his pack down and watched the slope the way a carpenter watches a straight board. Not for beauty, for angles, for what the wind couldn't reach. He heard the first laugh before he saw the riders. "Look at him," a voice carried, half swallowed by the gusts. "Picked a hill like it's a mother hen." Caleb didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the cut bank and the narrow strip of level ground at its base. In his head, he measured with habits, not tools. Shoulder height for the main chamber, arm span for the sleeping bench, 2 paces to the back wall, so the warmth wouldn't vanish into distance. He knew, without saying it, that if the winter turned mean, a timber box on open ground would bleed heat through every seam. The wind would find the cracks. The cold would sit under the floorboards like water. But the earth would hold. A second rider ranined closer, horse snorting white. "You aiming to dig yourself a grave, Rourke?" Caleb finally looked over. 3 men from the settlement line, the ones who'd built their houses up on the prairie like they were planting flags. Their coats were new wool. Their horses wore good leather. The middleman, Hollis Vane, had a moustache that looked combed with vanity. "I'm aiming to make a room," Caleb said. "A warm one." Hollis laughed again, louder, like volume could make truth. "Warm? You can't even afford boards?" Caleb felt heat rise in his neck, not from shame, but from the familiar burn of being judged by what people could see. They saw no lumber pile, no framed walls, no squared corner posts. They didn't see that he'd spent 2 weeks walking gullies and ridgelines, watching which way the snow drifted after small flurries, noticing where the grass lay flat from constant wind. He answered with the simplest thing: "I can afford a shovel." The men rode on, their laughter thinning into the wind. One tossed back a parting shot. "Make sure you leave a little hole so the Lord can find you down there." Caleb watched them go, then looked again at the slope. A south-facing bank meant sun, even weak sun, licking at the surface. It meant less drift piling right at the face if he set his entry low and angled. It meant, if he was careful, he could keep the roofline level with the ground above, so the wind skimmed over instead of slamming into it. He knelt and plunged his knife into the soil to test it. The blade met firm clay after 2 inches of loam. Good. Clay would stand if he cut it right, and where it wanted to crumble, he could pin it with stones. He scraped at the surface and found roots braided through the top layer like rope. Prairie sod. That sod, cut in slabs, could become his roof skin. He'd seen old soldiers do it on the march, and he'd seen a trapper's winter camp half buried in a hill like a muskrat lodge. People called it primitive. Caleb called it honest. He laid out his marks with short stakes, an opening no wider than his shoulders, because every extra inch was another inch for heat to escape. A short entry passage that would dip slightly, so cold air settled there instead of rolling into the main room. The main chamber carved into the bank like a cupped hand. He would keep the ceiling arched, not flat. Arches didn't sag as easily, and if weight came down, it would push along the curve instead of cracking straight through. By the time the sun slid lower, he had his coat off and his shirt damp under the arms. The shovel blade bit with a wet thud. Earth smell rose, dark, mineral, alive. His hands already ached, but it was the good ache, the kind that told him the day had moved forward. He paused once, listening to the wind. It was steady now, not a howl. Steady meant it could change. Steady meant it was practicing. Caleb wiped sweat with the back of his wrist and looked across the open prairie at the settlement's thin line of houses. Little rectangles against a vast, indifferent sky. He imagined what 8 days of hard wind could do to a rectangle with corners and a high roof. The thought sat in him like a stone. He drove the shovel in again, deeper, making the first cut that would become a doorway. If he was right, they would stop laughing. If he was wrong... He didn't finish the sentence. He only kept digging as daylight bled away and the hillside began, inch by inch, to accept him. The next morning came colorless, the sun a pale coin behind thin cloud. Caleb's fingers stiffened around the shovel handle until he warmed them by breathing into his gloves. The cut-bank face showed his work plainly now. A dark bite taken from the slope, a shallow recess with a floor tamped by boots and stubbornness. He didn't rush deeper. Rushing was how you caused a cave-in. First he studied the hillside again, crouching to sight along the bank, like he was lining up a rifle. The ground above bowed gently, not broken by animal holes or old slides. He pressed his palm to the soil. It was cold and slightly damp, which meant seepage could become a problem when the snow melted, or sooner, if a warm spell turned the top layer to slush and sent water down the face. He marked a line 2 paces out from the bank and started a trench along the base, not for show, not for neatness, but for the one thing nobody in town talked about until it ruined them: water. The trench angled away and downhill, shallow but steady, a drainage run that would pull melt and rain away from his doorway. He lined its lowest section with fist-sized stones he'd gathered from the creek bed, leaving gaps so water could slip through instead of pooling. By midday, he began shaping the entry passage. He kept it tight, cutting the sides straight and the ceiling low enough that he had to hunch. Comfort could wait. Control couldn't. A short, narrow entry meant less wind could shove itself inside. He sloped the passage down a few inches before it rose into the main chamber, just enough to make a cold sink. In still air, heavier cold would settle in that dip like water in a bowl, and the warmer air would stay higher where people lived. Inside the bank, he carved the main room wider, letting his shoulders relax. He took care with the ceiling, shaving it into a shallow arch. Every few minutes he stopped, tapped the roof with the shovel handle, and listened. A dull, steady sound meant the clay was holding. A hollow drum meant trouble. He found trouble near the right wall where the soil changed, sandier, loose. The bank there had once been a stream edge. He didn't pretend it would behave like clay. He dug out a little farther than he wanted, set flat stones against the weak spot like scales, and packed smaller rocks behind them, wedging tight until the wall stopped shedding grains under his fingernails. When the chamber reached the depth he'd planned, about the length of a wagon tongue, he cut a sleeping bench into the left side, raised a foot off the floor. He'd learned the hard way that the cold lived low. A bed on the ground was a bed in the coldest air you owned. He smoothed the bench with a board scrap, then scored small grooves in the floor leading toward the entry dip, so any spilled water or tracked snow would follow the grooves and not spread into a slick sheet. The roof came last, and it wasn't simply dirt overhead. Caleb laid pole-length willows across the chamber opening, each one peeled and set close so they shared the load. On top of those, he spread a mat of smaller brush, twigs, reed bundles, anything to keep the sod from crumbling through gaps. Only then did he go out to the prairie turf and cut sod blocks with a sharp spade, each slab heavy with roots. He carried them like burdens and set them on the roof upside down, roots to the sky. The root mat would knit together, resisting wind and shedding water better than loose soil. He staggered the seams like brickwork, then spread a thin layer of dry earth over the top to fill cracks. A roof made of living ground looked, from a distance, like he'd failed to build anything at all. That was the point. Before dusk, he turned to the problem that could kill him, even with perfect walls: air. He didn't want a smoky hole that stole breath. He punched a narrow vent shaft up through the roof near the back of the chamber, lining it with a section of stovepipe he'd traded for in town. Dented, mismatched, but sound. He didn't run it straight. He offset it with a simple baffle made from a flat stone set at an angle, so wind passing over the top wouldn't drive smoke back down. At the front, near the entry, he left a fist-width intake gap low to the ground, hidden behind a plank and a stack of stones. Fresh air would creep in low, feed the fire, and warm as it rose. Stale air and smoke would climb and find the pipe. It was a small system, almost quiet in its cleverness. Not magic, just direction and patience. When he finally sat on the cut bench and lit a twist of dry grass in a tin dish, the flame didn't gutter and die. It leaned toward the intake, then straightened, drawing steadily as smoke curled up and vanished into the vent. Caleb watched it until his eyes stung, not from smoke, but from the relief of seeing something work. Outside, the wind dragged across the sod roof and slid over it as if there were nothing there to grab. 2 days later, Caleb walked into town with clay still ground into the lines of his hands. He'd washed, but the smell of damp earth clung to him, the way smoke clung to men who lived by open hearths. The general store stood at the crossroads like a stubborn box, its porch boards creaking under boots, its windows fogged from bodies and breath. Inside, warmth hit him first. Stove heat mixed with kerosene, coffee, and wool. Then the sound, talk bouncing off plank walls, the little coughs and chuckles of people who believed winter was something you endured by insisting it couldn't beat you. Hollis Vane was there, of course, leaning on a barrel as if it owed him rent. 2 other settlers stood with him, Bram Hatcher, broad-shouldered and proud of his sawn lumber house, and Mrs. Lyle, the preacher's sister, whose eyes missed nothing and forgave even less. Caleb asked for lamp oil, nails, and a length of wire. He spoke to the storekeeper, but he felt the trio watching like crows, waiting for a misstep. Hollis made sure the room heard him. "Rourke, you get your hole finished? Or you still chewing your way into the hill 1 spoonful at a time?" A ripple of laughter moved through the store. Caleb set his coins on the counter with care. If his hands shook, he wouldn't give them the gift of seeing it. "It's finished enough to sleep in," he said. "Finished enough to hold heat." Bram snorted. "Heat? In dirt?" Caleb turned then, slow, meeting their eyes. "In earth. It's not the same thing." Mrs. Lyle tilted her head. "It's not fitting," she said, voice soft but sharp. "A man should build upright. A home is meant to be seen, meant to stand." "Seen by who?" Caleb asked before he could stop himself. Her gaze didn't waver. "By God. By neighbors. By decency." Hollis lifted his chin. "By your own wife, if you ever get one. No woman wants to live like a fox." Caleb felt the jab land, not because it was true, but because it was aimed at the part of him that already feared he'd chosen wrong. He imagined a storm pressing against the prairie, imagined corners filling with frost, imagined a roof taking weight until it groaned. He kept his voice even. "Decency won't keep you warm when the wind climbs." Bram laughed again. "Wind climbs? Wind is wind. You build tight, you chink your boards, you keep your stove fed. That's how men do it." Caleb nodded once. "And when the stove goes out at night?" A pause, small but real. Everyone had woken to cold ash at least once. He continued, not preaching, just laying tools on a table the way you laid cards. "Your walls are thin. Even with chinking, you've got seams every board length. Wind finds seams. It steals heat by pulling the warm air out and replacing it with cold. In my place, the walls don't leak. The ground itself doesn't move." Hollis waved a hand. "Ground moves plenty when it caves in." "It caves when you cut it wrong," Caleb said. "So you don't cut it wrong. You arch the ceiling. You keep the roof low and load spread. You don't dig in sand without stone." The storekeeper slid Caleb his oil and wire, trying to look like he wasn't listening. Everyone was listening. Mrs. Lyle's mouth tightened. "And smoke? You'll choke yourself. A proper house has a proper chimney. Caleb lifted the wire coil. That's why I'm buying this. I've got a vent pipe through the roof and an intake low by the door. Smoke rises. Fresh air comes in under it. If the wind blows hard, the roof line is level, so the gusts pass over. They don't slap a tall chimney sideways. Hollis leaned in, eyes bright with the pleasure of argument. So you're saying the rest of us are fools? Caleb wanted to say yes. He didn't. He swallowed the pride that always begged to be spoken, because pride was expensive in a place like this. I'm saying winter doesn't care what we call civilized, he said. It cares about physics, about whether the wind can touch your fire, about whether your roof gives it something to lift. Bram's grin faded a fraction. He knew, deep down, how his roof boards rattled at night, how his house creaked like a ship. But Hollis recovered first, because mocking was his trade. Physics, he repeated, stretching the word like it tasted bad. Listen to him. Next he'll tell us the hill is his mother, nursing him with dirt. The laughter returned, louder, safer. Caleb took his goods and stepped outside. The cold snapped at his lungs. On the porch he paused, looking out at the prairie. A thin line of cloud had gathered low to the west, not thick yet, but stacked like layers of wool. He felt a quiet unease crawl up his spine. Behind him, the door opened and shut, and voices rolled on, warm and careless. Caleb started walking, the wire biting his palm through his glove, and he told himself what he'd told himself since he first drove the shovel in. They would understand soon enough. That night, the first real cold arrived like a thief. The sky cleared after sundown, and with the clouds gone, the heat fled upward as if the world had opened a trap-door. By the time Caleb reached his cut-bank, the stars were sharp enough to hurt his eyes. Each breath snapped in his chest. The creek below made a brittle, ticking sound, where thin ice formed and cracked again. Inside the burrow, the air still carried a little of yesterday's warmth. It smelled of fresh-cut earth and willow bark. Caleb set the lamp on a flat stone shelf he'd carved into the wall, then crouched by his small stove, more a firebox than a proper iron stove, built from a traded metal drum and a tight-fitting door he'd fashioned from scrap. He lit kindling, fed it with split cottonwood, and listened. At first, the draught pulled clean. Smoke slid into the pipe with a soft, steady sigh. Caleb let his shoulders loosen. He cooked beans in a tin pot, ate with his back against the wall, and felt almost foolish for how tight he'd kept his jaw these past weeks. Then the trouble began. Quiet, sneaky trouble. Moisture from his breath and the simmering pot gathered on the coldest surfaces. It beaded along the vent pipe where it met the roof, then started to drip, slow and cold, onto the packed floor. His socks found the wet spot, and a chill crawled up his ankle. He looked up and saw a faint sheen on the ceiling, like sweat on skin. The burrow held heat, yes, but heat plus human breath made water. If that water soaked into the roof layer and then froze, it could turn the sod above into a hard, heavy cap. Too heavy, and even an arch complained. Caleb got up, wiped the vent pipe with a rag, and opened the intake gap a touch wider. Cold air slid in immediately, curling along the floor like a living thing. The flame responded, brightening, but the room's warmth thinned. He adjusted again, trying to find balance, enough fresh air to keep the ceiling dry, not so much that he fed the cold. A gust hit the hillside outside. It wasn't loud inside, just a low pressure change, like someone pressing on the walls. The stove flame flickered. Smoke hesitated at the vent mouth, then puffed back into the room in a grey cough. Caleb's eyes stung. He froze, counting heartbeats. Backdraft. He'd expected wind to skim the roof, but the vent top, just a few inches proud of the sod, had given the gust something to bully. The wind pressed down, and the smoke, obedient to pressure, searched for the easiest path, which was his lungs. He slapped the stove door shut, cutting the fire. The smoke slowed, but didn't stop at once. He dropped to his knees and crawled to the entry dip, where the air felt cleaner. He breathed shallow and fast, fighting the panic that came with the idea of suffocation in a space he'd built with his own hands. Don't run, he told himself. Think. He needed the vent to draw even under gust pressure. He'd seen it done on riverboats, chimneys with caps that turned the wind into suction instead of force. He didn't have a factory-made cap, but he had wire, a flat piece of tin, and stones. He worked by lamplight, hands clumsy in the cold. First, he bent the wire into a crude cage around the top of the pipe, something that could hold a hood. Then he shaped the tin into a small curved cover, like a shallow scoop, open on the downwind side. If the wind hit the curved face, it would split and slide around, leaving lower pressure behind the hood. Lower pressure meant pull. Pull meant draft. He climbed out into the night, the cold biting his cheeks instantly. The wind had risen, a steady push now, tugging at his coat like it wanted him off his feet. He scrambled up the bank's side using roots as handholds, found the vent top, and set the hood in place, anchoring it with wire and 2 fist-sized stones. His fingers burned as if dipped in boiling water, then went numb. Back inside, he relit the fire, cautiously. The flame caught, licked upward. Smoke rose, hesitated, and then slid smoothly into the pipe again, even as another gust shouldered the roof. Caleb watched the draft for a long minute, listening to the soft pull that meant the burrow was breathing. Only then did he let himself exhale fully. He spread dry straw near the damp floor spot and moved his bedding up onto the bench. Above him, the ceiling no longer shone with moisture. The air exchange was doing its work. The room was cooler now, but it was a controlled cool, not the creeping, murderous cold of outside. As he lay back, he thought of Bram's tall chimney and Hollis's proud roofline. He imagined the same gust testing their houses, finding seams, prying like fingers. He had solved one problem tonight. Winter would bring others, and it would not announce them politely. Caleb closed his eyes anyway, letting the earth's steady weight press around him like a shield. By the time the creek ice thickened enough to hold a boot, Caleb had turned his burrow from a clever hole into a disciplined place. He learned quickly that a shelter didn't keep you alive by existing. It kept you alive by the rules you followed inside it. He began with fuel. Cottonwood burned fast and dirty, but it was what the bottoms offered. He cut it into short lengths that fit his firebox without forcing the door ajar. A door left cracked was a door that let smoke wander. He stacked the wood in a dry niche near the entry where the cold sink lived, so any damp that crept in stayed away from his bedding. Then he built a second stack outside, wrapped in canvas and weighted with stones, because storms loved nothing more than catching a man with 1 day's fire and 7 days of cold. Food came next. He filled 2 sacks with dried beans and cornmeal, sealed in waxed cloth. Salt pork hung from a peg near the back wall, where the temperature stayed steady, cool enough to preserve, warm enough that it didn't turn to stone. He placed his water barrel on a low platform of rocks to keep it off the coldest floor, and every evening he chipped a little creek ice to top it off, because a barrel that ran low was a barrel that froze sooner. Then he built what the others would have called superstition, a second way out. The main entry was narrow and low, good for keeping wind out, but Caleb knew snow didn't care about good intentions. It drifted where it wanted. So he dug a crawl passage from the rear of the chamber, angling up and away, smaller than the entry, and left unfinished at the end, just a thin plug of earth he could punch through if the front buried. He reinforced that crawl with willow ribs and stone, not because it needed to look pretty, but because if it collapsed, it would become a grave. He tested it one afternoon by crawling through with a lamp, counting the turns, memorizing the feel. In the tightest spot, his shoulders brushed both walls. He forced himself to breathe slow. A man who panicked in a crawlway wasted air and time. Outside, Social pressure kept pace with the weather. On Sunday, Caleb went to the small church house, boots cleaned, hair damp from a cold wash. He sat near the back, but people's eyes travelled to him anyway, flicking like needles. After the service, Mrs. Lyle approached with a tight smile. "We prayed for you," she said, as if prayer could replace lumber. Caleb nodded. "I'll take it." Her gaze slid past him toward the prairie. "Men are talking. They say you're inviting hardship, that you're turning away from what's proper." "Proper doesn't stop a blizzard," Caleb said quietly. A young man nearby, Eli Mercer, newly married and eager to sound older than he was, spoke up. "My father says a man who lives underground is a man who expects to fail above it." Caleb looked at Eli's hands. Smooth, not much callus yet. "Your father ever lose a roof board in a wind?" Caleb asked. Eli flushed. "Everyone loses boards. Not everyone can replace them in a whiteout," Caleb said. Hollis Vane, who had drifted close like he smelled blood, chuckled. "Listen to him, planning for disasters that don't come." He tipped his hat toward Caleb. "What are you now, a prophet of snow?" Caleb didn't answer. He'd learned that arguing in public fed the wrong fire. Instead, he let his silence be a kind of refusal, then walked away toward his burrow, with the wind at his back and the settlement behind him. That evening, he added another rule. No open flame without the vent checked. He climbed the bank, cleared the vent hood of frost with a gloved hand, and listened for the draft by holding a thin strip of cloth near the intake. The cloth tugged inward, steady, good, breathable. He sealed the entry for the night with a fitted door of planks and hide, leaving only the measured gap for air. He set his lamp in its niche and sat on the sleeping bench, sharpening his knife with slow strokes. Outside, the sky had taken on a strange look, high clouds in flat layers, like pressed wool. The air felt heavier, as if the prairie itself held its breath. Caleb ran through his stores in his head: wood, water, beans, salt, lamp oil. He counted days the way other men counted coins. 7 days would be safe. 9 days, if he was careful. He thought again of the laugh in Hollis's voice, of Bram's confidence, of Eli's borrowed certainty. Caleb didn't wish them harm. He only wished they understood that winter was not a debate. When he lay down, the burrow's walls gave off a slow, stored warmth, the kind you felt more than you measured. His lamp dimmed, and the earth around him settled into its quiet, heavy patience. Somewhere in the dark outside, the wind shifted. The morning the sky went iron, Caleb noticed it before he felt it. Sound changed first. The prairie usually carried noise, distant hammering, a dog's bark, the creek talking under ice. Now the air seemed to swallow everything, thick and padded. Even his boots on frozen ground sounded muffled, as if he walked on felt. He climbed out of the burrow and stared west. A low bank of cloud sat on the horizon like a dark shelf. Above it, another layer, and another. Not the scattered, harmless kind, but stacked and flat, edges sharp, like someone had piled slate plates across the entire sky. The light that seeped through was sickly, grey-blue, making the snow patches look bruised. Caleb squatted by his drainage trench and ran a gloved finger along the stones. Dry. Good. If the storm brought a warm start, wet snow that later froze, his trench would matter more than any prayer. He checked the vent hood. Frost clung to the wire cage, but the opening was clear. He tapped it gently, listening. The pipe rang hollow and clean. No ice plug yet. When he went back inside, he packed his gear in a way that told the truth. He didn't expect to travel for a while. He moved the extra wood stack from outside into the entry passage, wedging it against the wall so it wouldn't block the cold sink. He filled his water barrel to the brim and added a pinch of salt, not enough to make it brine, just enough to lower the freezing point a fraction. A small trick, but small tricks were what men survived on. By noon, The wind arrived. Not a gust, not a playful shove. A firm, constant push that made the grass all lean the same way and held it there. It drove fine snow, old, powdery stuff, across the ground in snakes that hissed and vanished. The horizon began to blur, edges smudged as if someone rubbed charcoal across the world. Caleb stood outside longer than he should have, reading it like a face. He'd lived through storms as a boy, but those had come with drama, thunder, sudden temperature drops, the obvious slam of weather turning. This felt different, organized, patient. He realized with a cold clarity that the storm wasn't coming for the night. It was coming to stay. He understood it too late to do the one thing that would have soothed the rest of the settlement. Warn them early enough that they could reinforce, dig out supplies, or at least agree on a plan. If he ran to town now, he'd arrive with snow already in his eyebrows, and Hollis would call him fearful again. Bram would say it was nothing. People would lose precious daylight arguing. So Caleb did the only thing that mattered. He prepared to be a fixed point. He took a shovel and began cutting a narrow trench from the burrow's front door out toward the creek, not deep, just a guideline in the snowless ground, a path that would stay visible longer than open prairie once the drift began. Every few steps, he planted a stake with a strip of cloth tied to it. The cloth snapped in the wind like a warning flag. He worked until the first heavy flakes started, large, wet, reluctant things that clung to his coat and melted into dark spots. Wet snow meant weight. Weight meant roofs tested early. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply. The wet layer began to crust. Snow on snow, then ice on top, the kind of mix that could turn a doorway into concrete and make a chimney choke with rime. Caleb hurried inside and closed the door, sealing it tight, except for the measured intake. He lit the stove carefully and watched the vent for backdraft. The flame held steady. The hood was working. Outside, the wind found its full voice. It roared along the prairie, not in bursts, but in a continuous grinding sound like sand against wood. It threw snow at the hillside in sheets. The burrow shuddered faintly, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. Caleb sat on the bench and listened. He could tell when gusts hit the settlement, because faint cracks echoed through the wind, boards flexing, nails complaining, shutters slamming. Those sounds came and went, but the roar remained. He ate sparingly, not because he wanted to, but because he was already counting. If this lasted 3 days, he was comfortable. 5 days, manageable. 8 days. 8 days would mean people made mistakes. As darkness fell, the world outside disappeared. There was no horizon, no sky, no ground, only moving white and the sensation of pressure. Caleb placed his hand flat against the earth wall and felt how steady it was, how indifferent it remained to the wind's tantrum. Somewhere out there, in timber houses with proud roofs, families would be listening to the same roar and telling themselves it would ease by morning. Caleb fed the stove one more piece of wood and stared at the vent pipe like it was a lifeline. He didn't sleep much. On the second day, morning never quite arrived. The light outside the vent shifted from black to a murky milk grey, but there was no sense of sun. The wind hadn't rested. It pressed and pressed, the way a hand can press on a door without ever knocking. Snow hissed over the roof like sand poured from a great height. Caleb checked the vent first. Always the vent. He held his strip of cloth at the intake gap near the floor. It tugged inward, weak but steady. He opened the stove and fed it 2 narrow splits of wood, then watched the smoke. It rose, curled, vanished. The draught held. He allowed himself half a tin of beans and a heel of bread. Chewing in the dim, he listened harder than he ate. Sometime near what he guessed was mid-morning, a new sound cut through the storm's constant voice, a muffled pounding, irregular and frantic, from the direction of the door. He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. The pounding came again, A fist on wood, then a scraping, then a thud, as if someone had fallen against the entrance. Caleb dropped the spoon and crossed the chamber in 3 strides. He pressed his ear to the door. A voice reached him, thinned by snow and wood. "Rourke! Caleb! For God's sake!" "Hollis." Caleb unbarred the door and pushed. It didn't move. Snow had already packed against it, dense and wet, then frozen into a heavy plug. He set his shoulder and shoved again, gaining an inch, then another. A thin edge of white crumbled inward, followed by a blast of air so cold it felt like it flayed his teeth. He grabbed the small shovel he kept by the entry and carved away at the drift from inside, swinging in short, choppy strokes. Each scoop lightened the load on the door, until at last it lurched open a hand's width. An arm forced its way in, then a shoulder. Hollis squeezed through, face raw and rimed with ice, followed by a smaller bundle Caleb recognized as Eli Mercer's wife, wrapped in a blanket, eyes wide and glassy. Behind them, snow pressed at their backs, like another body trying to crowd in. "Enough!" Caleb snapped. "One at a time." He hauled the woman through by her elbows and kicked the door closed against the storm's reaching hand. The room shrank instantly around the 3 of them. Their harsh breaths sucked at the shared air. Hollis staggered, leaning on the wall. "House," he rasped. "Chimney blocked. Smoke. Kids coughing. Roof creaking like a ship." His voice broke. The swagger was gone, stripped by cold and fear. "Bram's place. Half the roof went. We couldn't see his lantern anymore." Caleb swallowed the first surge of anger that rose, not at them, but at the waste of what had been warned and laughed off. Anger would not help them breathe. "Sit," he ordered. "Both of you. Keep your mouths shut if you're not asking for air." Eli's wife, Mara, he recalled belatedly, shivered violently on the sleeping bench, blankets clutched around her. Her lips had the early purple of deep chill. Hollis's gloved hands shook as he peeled ice from his moustache. "How far?" Caleb asked. Hollis blinked. "What? How far did you walk?" "From town." Hollis coughed, a harsh, tearing sound. "Couldn't see past my own arm. We followed the creek until we found your stakes. Nearly missed the last one." Caleb pictured the thin line of cloth flags he'd planted. They had become more than markers. They were a decision made days ago, reaching forward to grab an arm. He did the math quickly. 2 more bodies meant more heat, but also more carbon dioxide, more moisture. The stove would need more fuel to keep the space comfortable, but more fire meant more exhaust to push out through the same vent. Generosity as a feeling had no place here. Generosity as a calculus did. He pointed at Hollis. "You help me. No arguments." Then at Mara. "You rest. You're on the bench because the air is warmest there." Mara tried to speak. Her teeth chattered instead. Caleb handed her a cup of lukewarm water. "Small sips," he said. "If you gulp, you'll cramp." He and Hollis moved the inside wood stack tighter to the entry wall, opening more floor space without blocking the cold sink. Each log they shifted stirred the air, lifting a faint, earthy chill. "You were right," Hollis muttered under his breath, almost too low to hear. Caleb didn't look up. "We don't have room for that conversation." He rationed their next hours in his head. Fire, small, constant, never roaring. Food, shared, but measured. Vent checks, every hour at least, even through the night. No one opened the door without him saying so. No lamp burned longer than necessary. "The others?" he asked finally. Hollis stared at the floor. "Some stayed. Said the storm would blow out in a day. Said it always had." His jaw clenched. "Mrs. Lyle barred her door. Told us the Lord was her roof." Caleb pictured her neat house with its straight lines and proud chimney. Then he pictured snow climbing its sides like a drowning man climbing a ladder. He tamped down the image. There were 3 souls in this room who still had choices. "We can hold 3 easy," he said. 4 if someone else finds the stakes. 5, maybe, if we go cold and dark half the time." He didn't say what more than that would mean. Hollis looked up, eyes bloodshot. "You'll take them in? After—" He gestured helplessly, encompassing weeks of laughter. Caleb met his gaze. "If they make it to the door, they've already paid for their mistake." Outside, the wind screamed against the hillside, denied purchase. The sod roof took the weight, spread it, and said nothing. Inside, with each shallow breath, the burrow's air warmed by degrees, threaded now with the sharp, human scent of fear. By the third day, snow had learned the shape of everything. It found the settlement's corners and filled them. It climbed the leeward sides of houses until windows disappeared. It packed into chimneys and under eaves, froze there, and turned soft problems into hard ones. The storm didn't need violence now. It used persistence. Caleb knew this because the sounds changed. The distant cracks and slams that had come the first night were gone. Timber didn't complain anymore. It had either settled into silence or broken. The wind still roared, but now it roared over a smoother world. Inside the burrow, the air felt different too. Not colder, just heavier. 3 people breathing in a space meant moisture on the ceiling again, faint and shining at the edges, where the earth was closest to the surface. Caleb woke from shallow sleep with the familiar dread. If the vent iced shut, they'd never get a second warning. He crawled to the intake gap and held up the cloth strip. It barely moved. "Get up," he told Hollis, voice low. "Now." Hollis blinked awake, disoriented, then saw Caleb's face and sat up fast. Mara lay curled, exhausted, her breathing thin but steadier than yesterday. Caleb cracked the stove door to see the fire. The coals glowed dully, starved. A thin thread of smoke seeped into the room instead of rising clean. Not a full backdraft, but close enough to smell. "The vent's choking," Caleb said. "Ice or packed snow. If it seals, we'll be done in an hour." Hollis swallowed. "Can't we dig out the door and—" "The door's not the problem," Caleb cut in. "Air is." He grabbed the short-handled shovel and a length of rope. "You're coming with me to the roof. If I go alone and slip, you'll have no one to clear it." Hollis's mouth opened as if to argue, then shut. He nodded once, hard. Caleb wrapped Mara tighter and pointed at the bench. "Stay. No stove fuel while we're out. If smoke backs up, open the intake stone wider and crawl to the entry dip. Do you hear me?" Mara's eyes flicked to him, fear sharpening her focus. She nodded. At the door, Caleb braced himself. The drift had packed again overnight, sealing tight. He and Hollis worked from inside, chopping and scooping until the door could move. When it finally cracked open, the storm punched in like a fist. Visibility was measured in inches. Snow whipped sideways, hard enough to sting through cloth. The wind stole words. Caleb tied the rope around Hollis's waist and looped the other end around his own, then anchored it to an interior peg before stepping out. A lifeline, crude but necessary. They didn't walk so much as crawl upward along the hillside, gripping roots and frozen sod. The world was white motion. Caleb kept his eyes on the bank, counting handholds. If he lifted his head too high, he lost all orientation, sky and ground the same. When his fingers found the vent hood, he felt the problem immediately. A thick collar of rime ice had grown around the opening, built by moist exhaust meeting brutal wind. The hood that had saved his draft in lesser weather had become a surface for ice to cling to. Caleb's gloved thumb pressed the edge. It didn't give. He drew his knife and began chipping. Each strike rang faintly through the pipe. Chips flew and vanished. The wind tried to snatch the knife from his hand. Hollis hovered close, one arm wrapped around a root, the other steadying Caleb's shoulder. Caleb worked fast, but not wild. Wild made mistakes. Mistakes meant falling, or cracking the pipe, or dropping the knife into the white. After a minute that felt like an hour, the ice collar thinned. Caleb leaned close and listened. He heard it. Faint suction, the pipe trying to breathe. Not enough. He needed more than clearing. He needed the exhaust warmer at the top, so it didn't freeze instantly, or he needed to reduce exposed metal. A thought snapped into place. "Hollis!" he shouted, though the wind ate most of it. He gestured wildly toward the door, then mimed rapping something. Hollis stared, confused. Caleb yanked at the rope, tugging him closer, and yelled in his ear, "Blanket! Bring a blanket and oilcloth if you have it. We need to insulate the pipe above the roof." Hollis's eyes widened. He scrambled back down the slope on hands and knees, the rope keeping him from vanishing. Caleb stayed, clinging with one arm and chipping with the other, clearing the opening as best he could. When Hollis returned, he dragged a folded wool blanket wrapped in canvas. Caleb wrapped the blanket around the section of pipe that protruded above the sod, then covered it with the canvas, tying it tight with wire so the wind couldn't peel it away. He left the very top open so smoke could escape, but he reduced the exposed metal length by half. Insulation wouldn't stop ice forever, but it would slow it. It would give them hours instead of minutes. They crawled back down, nearly blind, and forced their way into the burrow. Caleb slammed the door, packed snow back against its base, and then immediately checked the stove. The draft returned with a grateful pull. Smoke rose cleanly. The room's air, which had begun to sour, lightened, as if a hand had loosened around their throats. Hollis sagged onto the floor, chest heaving. "I thought," he began, then couldn't finish. Caleb crouched by Mara. Her eyes were open, fixed on the vent pipe, as if it were a serpent. "It's breathing again," Caleb said, softer. "We bought time." Outside, the storm didn't care about bargains. It kept laying its weight on the prairie, and somewhere in the buried settlement, other doors were sealing shut, without anyone inside knowing what the air was doing. Time stopped behaving like time. By the fourth day, daylight was only a thinning of darkness. By the fifth, Caleb stopped trying to name the hours and started naming tasks. Vent, fire, water, bodies, door, repeat. He could feel the storm not as weather, but as siege, an enemy that didn't charge, only surrounded and waited. More people came, not in a rush, not in a neat line, one here, two there, whenever someone finally admitted they couldn't last another night in a freezing timber box. A boy arrived first, maybe 10, face so windburned it looked peeled. He stumbled in on hands and knees when Caleb cracked the door, then collapsed into the cold sink dip, too tired to cry. Caleb recognized him as Bram Hatcher's nephew. Behind him, after long minutes, came Bram himself, shoulders hunched as if still trying to carry a roof on his back. Bram didn't laugh now. He couldn't. His lips were split and bleeding. He stood in the entry, eyes darting over the burrow, stone-pinned walls, arched ceiling, the vent pipe wrapped in blanket and canvas, the sleeping bench crowded with bodies. "You can't fit us," Bram whispered. Caleb looked at what he had. Mara on the bench, Hollis half asleep on the floor, the boy shivering in the dip. Space was already tight, air already shared. Fuel was a dwindling pile that looked smaller each morning. He made the decision anyway. "In," he said, "but you follow rules, or you go back out." Bram nodded like a man signing away pride. Caleb reorganized the burrow like a foreman. Bench for the weakest, Mara and the boy. Floor for the adults, feet toward the warmer back wall, heads toward the cooler entry, so exhaled moisture didn't rise and freeze the ceiling as badly. Everyone's boots stayed near the door where the cold held them. Wet leather in warmth meant mildew and stench and sickness. He cut the fire smaller, not larger. A roaring stove ate wood and dumped too much moisture-laden heat into the roof layer. A small, steady burn kept the room survivable without sweating the ceiling. He used a trick his father had taught him, bank coals under ash at night, so they smouldered low, then revived them with thin kindling at morning. It saved wood and kept the pipe warm enough to resist icing. Water became the next fight. The barrel held, but the cup became precious. Caleb melted snow in a pot, only when the stove was already hot for cooking. He made each person drink by turns, small measured sips, because too much water too fast made bodies sweat, and sweat in cold became another enemy. The 6th day brought the point of no return. Caleb heard it as a new vibration through the earth wall, a deep, distant cracking that didn't come from wind. It came from weight. Then a muffled crash that seemed to fold the air itself. Bram lifted his head, eyes wild. "That was my place," he said, voice flat with certainty. No one spoke after that. Grief would have to wait. Survival didn't grant time for mourning. That night, the vent began to frost again despite the insulation. Caleb checked it every hour, waking Hollis and Bram in turns to help. They formed a rotation. One man slept, one man watched the pipe, one man tended the coals. Caleb didn't trust exhaustion. Exhaustion made men forget to open the intake after cooking, made them close the door too tight, made them breathe too deep in panic. On the 7th day, the storm tried a new angle. Silence. For a few minutes, the wind eased. The world outside went unnaturally quiet, as if holding still for a kill. Hollis sat up, hope flickering. "It's done," he whispered. Caleb shook his head. "That's the eye of it," he said, "or it's regrouping." He was right. The roar returned, sharper, carrying colder air. Their door plug hardened. The burrow's walls grew colder to the touch. The earth's stored warmth finally spent after days of continuous draw. Caleb adjusted again. He hung a blanket like a curtain across the main chamber, creating a smaller, warm room at the back, where bodies could heat each other and the stove. The entry and cold sink became a buffer zone, sacrificing space to protect the air. It felt crowded, almost unbearable. But the temperature rose 2 degrees, enough to stop Mara's lips from turning darker. On the 8th day, Caleb woke to a strange brightness. Not sun, not warmth, just light filtering down the entry crack, steadier than it had been. He crawled to the door and pressed his ear to the wood. The wind was still there, but farther away, like a river no longer at flood stage. He looked at the others, faces hollowed by smoke and fear, eyes too bright. "Nobody goes out yet," he said. "Not until we can see the stakes." Because storms lied at the end. They offered a gap, then slammed shut again, trapping the reckless in the open. He checked the vent one more time, felt the draft tug at his skin, and held onto the open loop he'd carried since the first laugh. Whether his buried idea could outlast the prairie's worst. If the world stayed quiet long enough for a door to open without fighting snow, the answer would be written on the faces of the people who'd mocked him, and now breathed, because his burrow still breathed.